An injured bear cub enters a stranger's house in the middle of the night. Then this happened: the wind howled like a wounded beast through the pines of the Colorado backcountry, its icy breath lashing the darkening sky. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, erasing paths and swallowing sound, turning the world into a pale, frozen canvas. Daniel Hale stood at the threshold of his log cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand, the other resting absently on the doorframe. The fire crackled behind him, casting flickering light across the worn floorboards and walls lined with old ranger maps and photos dulled by time. Somewhere beneath the stack of firewood near the stove lay the letter he never opened, the final report from the Forest Service documenting the wildfire that had taken his partner's life and left Daniel shattered, in a way no physical wound ever could. He hadn't read it. He didn't need to. He'd lived every second of it, and now he lived in its wake. He had come to the mountains to vanish, that had been the plan. Let the seasons bury him in silence and cold. Let time wear him down like river rock, smooth and without edge. His days had become rituals, chopping wood, trapping small game, scanning the ridgeline with his old binoculars. Nights were longer, darker, filled with the ghosts of things unsaid. It was better this way, or so he told himself. Until the sound came. Faint at first, it wove through the wind like a thread, not a branch snapping, not the shriek of a hawk. It was low, keening, half growl, half cry, a sound of pain. Daniel paused, breath steaming in the cold, ears straining to catch it again. He heard it, not far. Deep, primal instinct unfurled within him, the ranger in him rising before the man could overrule it. He grabbed his flashlight, slung his old canvas coat around his shoulders, and stepped into the storm. Snow came up to his calves as he moved through the trees, boots crunching softly with each step. The beam of his flashlight danced over ice-coated branches and animal tracks barely visible beneath the drift. The cry came again, closer now. He crested a small ridge and stopped. There, at the base of a pine, half buried in snow and trembling from cold and fear, was a bear cub. For a moment, Daniel didn't breathe. The cub couldn't have been more than a year old. Its black coat was patchy with frost and blood, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. A steel jaw trap lay rusted beside it, its cruel teeth stained with blood. The bear's breath came in quick pants, each one sending a puff of white into the frigid air. It didn't growl, didn't run. It just stared at him, wide-eyed, with a kind of hollow plea Daniel hadn't seen since the fire. It struck him like a blow, the helplessness, the surrender. He felt it in his marrow. He should have walked away. He knew that. Wild animals didn't belong inside homes. Bears didn't get second chances. They were born to fight or die, not be coddled like pets. But something cracked inside him, a memory of fire roaring through trees, of trying to lift his partner's unconscious body before the ceiling gave way, of failing, of running, of living when he shouldn't have. He dropped to his knees beside the cub. "Easy," he murmured, setting the flashlight down in the snow. "I've got you." The cub's body was ice-cold under his fingers, the fur stiff and matted. Blood had crusted around the wound on its leg. It didn't resist as Daniel wrapped his coat around it. Barely strong enough to lift its head, it whimpered once, soft, broken. He lifted it carefully, cradling the small body against his chest. Its weight was awkward but not heavy, malnourished, Daniel thought grimly. Starved, maybe for days. As he trudged back toward the cabin, snow whipped at his face, trying to blind him. He moved like a man carrying something more than just flesh and bone. He was carrying a life, and somewhere deep down, he hoped it might carry something back into his. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. Daniel laid the cub gently on a folded blanket near the fire, stoked the flames higher, then set about cleaning the wound. Old ranger training came back to him in fits and starts: how to dress a wound without making it worse, how to recognize infection, how to tell when it was already too late. But the cub, against all odds, held on. It whimpered under the sting of antiseptic but didn't bite, didn't thrash, just stared at Daniel with those dark, haunted eyes. He fed it broth, deer meat boiled down with herbs, a little honey water. At first, it turned its head away, but later, as night deepened and the storm howled like a chorus of wolves, it licked the edge of the bowl. Daniel sat beside the fire, shotgun across his knees, eyes never leaving the cub. He didn't name it that night. He didn't speak much at all. Just watched it breathe, steady and shallow, and thought maybe he'd done something right for once. Morning came slow and pale. The storm had passed, leaving a world sealed in silence and snow. The cabin felt different now, not just warmer. Lived in. Shared. The cub stirred as Daniel crouched nearby with a fresh bowl of water. "You're still here," he said, surprised at how much that mattered. The cub blinked up at him. Its paw twitched slightly. It was alive. Against reason, against odds, it was still here. He called it Ash. There was something fitting about that name, something about the soot left behind when fire took everything else. Ash was the reminder, the proof that something had survived. Days turned into a week. Ash's leg, though still stiff and raw, began to heal. He ate more, drank more, slept less. He would lift his head when Daniel entered the room, let out soft grunts when the fire dimmed, and occasionally pressed his cold nose against Daniel's arm. The man found himself talking again, not just muttering out loud, but talking about things he hadn't said to anyone, about Charlie, his partner, about the wildfire, about the weight of carrying someone's final scream in your bones. Ash didn't answer, of course, but he listened, in the way only animals could, without judgment or pity. Daniel felt lighter after those conversations, though he never admitted it aloud. By the end of the second week, Ash was hobbling across the room, clumsy but determined. His wildness was still there, visible in the way his ears perked at sudden sounds or how he growled at his reflection in the old mirror above the mantel. But there was trust now too, not obedience, not tameness, something deeper. Respect, perhaps. One night, as the wind blew softer and the stars came out in quiet brilliance, Daniel sat on the porch steps with Ash beside him. The bear's breath came in slow huffs, visible in the cold air. Daniel took a sip of coffee, his gaze lost in the woods beyond. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "for either of us." Ash grunted, then leaned slightly against his side. Daniel didn't move. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows in soft streaks, casting faint gold across the floorboards as the fire in the hearth hissed low, throwing quiet shadows against the cabin walls. Daniel stirred from the chair he'd dozed off in, joints aching from the awkward position. The warmth of the mug he'd clutched all night long was now reduced to cold dregs. Across from him, nestled in a tangle of wool blankets and an old flannel shirt, the bear cub still lay curled, though its sides rose and fell more steadily than the night before. Daniel blinked sleep from his eyes, trying to reconcile the surreal truth of what he was seeing with the dull ache of his memories. A black bear cub, wounded, orphaned, lying by his fire like some strange, quiet guest. He rubbed his face, his fingers dragging down the coarse stubble that clung to his jaw. "Still here, huh?" he murmured, voice rough from disuse. The cub didn't stir, but it hadn't died. That meant something. He stood slowly, stretching out a back that cracked in protest, then crossed to the woodpile beside the hearth and threw 2 more logs into the fire. It crackled to life, casting the room in a burst of heat and light. The temperature outside remained brutal. February in this part of Colorado wasn't kind. The snowdrifts out front were up past his thighs, and the generator had struggled all night to keep the backup heat from cutting out. The kettle whistled faintly on the stovetop, and Daniel poured a cup of hot water into the same chipped mug, dropping in pine needles and a sliver of dried lemon. He drank in silence, eyes never straying far from the cub. At some point, he'd need to call someone, Fish and Wildlife, the sanctuary north of Telluride, maybe even the ranger office he still had memorized, despite the fact he hadn't called it in 6 months. But not yet. Not today. Today was just about surviving, for both of them. Midday crept in with no fanfare. Daniel went about his routine as best he could, checked the traps he'd laid in the backwoods, gathered kindling, boiled broth from snowmelt and dried meat. Every time he returned to the cabin, his gaze was drawn to the cub like a lodestar. He worked mostly in silence, the same way he had since the fire, when the noise of people had grown too much and the sound of his own name had begun to sting like a fresh burn. But as the day wore on and the cub's eyes began to track him across the room, Daniel found himself speaking, first in murmurs, then in low, even sentences. "You've got fight in you," he said as he ladled another portion of broth into a shallow bowl, crouching beside the cub whose head now lifted ever so slightly. "Takes grit to survive a trap. Most don't. Rangers find bones, blood trails, not eyes looking back." The cub blinked slowly, its ears twitching at the sound of his voice. Daniel set the bowl down and leaned back on his heels. "They say animals don't grieve, but that's a lie. I've seen wolves wail, elk refuse to leave the fallen. You know loss, don't you?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, and Daniel swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. "Me too." That night, he dreamed of fire again, of trees splintering like bones, of smoke choking out the sun. In the dream, he carried his partner through ash and flame, legs burning, lungs full of cinders, but he was always too slow. The forest always closed in behind him. He woke with a cap of sweat cold on his skin despite the fire's warmth. Across from him, the cub, still nameless in his mind, stared at him with those fathomless black eyes, its head tilted slightly. Daniel pressed a hand to his chest, grounding himself. "Just a dream, Ash," he said hoarsely, and then paused, surprised at the word that had slipped from his mouth. Ash. It stuck, soft and solid, a name pulled from the ruins. A name that fit. "Ash," he repeated, this time with conviction, and the cub gave a soft huff, closing its eyes as if accepting the title. By the 4th day, Ash stood on trembling legs. He was no longer the skeletal, frost-bitten creature Daniel had carried from the woods. His leg, still swollen and wrapped in gauze, supported his weight in short bursts. Daniel watched him from the table where he carved a replacement snare, noting the way Ash's nose lifted to the sense of stew and old wood smoke, the way his ears perked when Daniel moved. There was wildness in him still, of course, flashes of teeth when startled, a stubborn streak that showed when Daniel tried to clean his wound, but there was also a growing gentleness, something less instinct and more recognition. Trust, maybe. It unnerved Daniel more than he wanted to admit. He found himself talking more, recounting pieces of his past in fragments, stories about backcountry rescues, elk migrations, the wild mare he'd once followed for 10 days straight before she finally let him close enough to see her foal. He didn't know why he spoke, only that the silence no longer swallowed him whole. Ash listened, always listening, as if the stories were wine that stirred something deep and ancient in his bear's heart. At night, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. Daniel caught himself laughing once, when Ash tried to clumsily paw at a dangling piece of jerky and fell backward with a surprised grunt. The sound startled him, it had been so long. Weeks passed. The snow outside grew denser, heavier, a world still gripped by the fist of winter. But inside, things changed. Daniel cleared space for Ash to move freely, built a low trough of water in the corner using an old drawer and a tarp. He adjusted the stove's output so the heat stayed steady even when he went out on supply runs. The cub had begun following him from room to room, limping still, but with increasing steadiness. He'd even begun to eat on his own. Daniel didn't call for help. He told himself it was just until spring, just until Ash could walk without pain, fend for himself. But the truth wrapped tighter than snow on a pine branch. He didn't want Ash to go. Because Ash had become more than company. He was a presence. A purpose. And Daniel, for the first time since the fire, didn't feel entirely alone. Then came the radio call, crackling through the old handheld left on the mantel. The voice was familiar, Jenny, a field biologist stationed 70 miles west. We've had reports of an orphaned cub out near your sector. Traps have been found, too. You seen anything, Hale? Daniel stared at the radio, heart suddenly loud in his chest. His hand hovered over the device for a long while before pressing the button. Nothing up here, he lied softly. Just snow. Behind him, Ash stirred, blinking up from his nest of blankets, his eyes full of that same knowing look that had met Daniel the night they found each other. A look that said, I am here. I survived. So did you. And Daniel, staring into those deep eyes, whispered back, so we did. Spring did not arrive with a sudden thaw or the dramatic rush of meltwater, but with small, nearly invisible changes. The snow shrinking by inches instead of feet, birdsong threading cautiously through the trees, the sun lingering a little longer each evening, as though testing its welcome after a long exile. Daniel noticed it first in the way the shadows shifted across the porch in the afternoon, in how the wind no longer bit straight to the bone but merely grazed the skin. Then he saw it in Ash. The bear had grown noticeably heavier, his coat rich and glossy now, no longer the brittle, patchy mess of frost and blood that Daniel had first carried into his cabin. The limp was still there, but fading, the wounded leg slowly relearning its strength. And every day, the cub tested himself further, hobbling outside the door, sniffing at the world like it was new. Which, in a way, it was. Daniel had begun leaving the door open during the warmer hours, letting the scent of pine needles and thawed soil drift in. Ash would rise from his spot near the hearth, lumber toward the threshold with curious eyes, and sit there, just on the edge between wild and safe. Neither crossed fully into the other's world, but both had come to recognize the shape of it. Daniel watched Ash's slow, careful movements with a complicated feeling in his chest. There was pride, certainly. Relief. But beneath it all, a quiet, persistent ache, like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. Ash was healing. That meant he wouldn't stay. One afternoon, while Ash was out nosing around the edges of the clearing, Daniel found himself rummaging through an old box tucked beneath his bed. It was filled with ranger gear, maps, compasses, field notes from the years before the fire. He hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. He pulled out a faded photograph of himself and Charlie, taken at the end of a long trail survey. They were smiling, sunburned, dirt-smudged, arms slung around each other like brothers. Behind them, the Rockies stretched vast and silent. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. Then he slipped it into his shirt pocket and walked outside. Ash was sprawled in the patchy grass near the fire pit, snout resting on a large sun-warmed rock. He raised his head as Daniel approached, blinking sleepily. "You're not limping today," Daniel said, lowering himself to sit a few feet away. Ash huffed softly, then resumed his lounging. "You're getting better." "Faster than I expected," Daniel added, and his voice caught slightly at the end. Ash turned to him, head tilted in that way he often did when Daniel spoke, as if trying to understand the meaning rather than just the sound. "You'll be leaving soon," Daniel said, and this time it wasn't a question. Ash didn't answer, couldn't answer, and yet his stillness said everything. The silence that fell between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of truth. And Daniel hated it. 2 days later, the ranger station called again. This time, it wasn't just a check-in. They had found a set of paw prints matching a juvenile black bear's in a neighboring valley and were sending a team to investigate. "If you've got anything unusual out your way, now's the time to report it," Jenny's voice crackled through the old radio. Daniel stared at Ash, who was pawing at the earth near the woodpile, flipping a flat stone with surprising delicacy. He hesitated, fingers resting on the transmit button. "Nothing yet," he said at last. "I'll keep an eye out." But the call had set something in motion. They would come looking. It was only a matter of time. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind sift through the eaves, the creak of the old cabin settling into itself. Across the room, Ash was curled in his usual spot, but he stirred more often now, as though sensing the shift. The next morning, Daniel set out early, hiking higher into the ridge than he had in weeks. The sky was impossibly clear, the air thin and sharp. He needed time to think. To breathe. He found himself drawn to the place where the fire had turned, where he'd last seen Charlie alive, where the forest had burned so hot the ground itself had blistered. Now, months later, the blackened skeletons of trees still stood like mourners frozen mid-scream. Daniel stood among them, feeling the way silence pressed down like snow. He knelt and touched the earth. Something green was growing there, tiny shoots, impossibly fragile. Life returning. He sat for a long time before turning back. When he returned to the cabin, Ash was gone. Panic surged up his spine like cold water. He dropped his pack and called out, then immediately felt foolish. Ash didn't come when called. He wasn't a dog. But still, Daniel searched the perimeter, then the tree line, his chest tightening more with each empty moment. An hour later, he found Ash halfway down the trail that led toward the valley floor. The bear was just sitting there, as if waiting. He looked back at Daniel, then forward again, nose lifting to the breeze. Wild called, and he had answered. Daniel stood there, not moving. He wanted to run forward, to grab Ash by the scruff, drag him back, scream, "Not yet." But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he sat down beside him. The two of them watched the sunset bleed slowly over the RGE line. "I can't keep you," Daniel whispered, and the words felt like stones in his throat. "And I shouldn't." Ash exhaled through his nose, low and steady. Daniel reached out, resting a hand lightly on the thick fur between Ash's shoulders. The bear didn't flinch. "When you go," Daniel said, "go knowing you were the reason I stayed. That I came back." The next morning, Ash was gone. No paw prints by the door, no trail to follow, just absence. Daniel stood on the porch a long while, eyes scanning the edge of the trees. He didn't cry, not then. He went inside and sat beside the cold fireplace, hands resting on his knees, listening to the hum of the waking forest. Days passed, then weeks. The snow retreated in earnest. Green returned to the land. Birds nested beneath the eaves. Life, undeterred, resumed its ancient rhythm. Daniel found himself fixing the roof one day, then reassembling the old wood sign that hung near the trailhead, Hale Ranger Station. He hadn't touched it since the fire. He cleaned the lettering with oil and cloth, then added something beneath it in smaller letters, Wildlife Sanctuary. When Jenny radioed again, he didn't dodge. He told her about Ash, about the injury, the weeks of recovery. He expected anger, maybe even a fine, but she just listened, then said, "He's lucky he found you." Daniel replied, "No. I was the lucky one." Later that spring, a local rescue brought in an injured fox kit, then a fawn whose mother had been hit by a snowplow. People began calling. Donations arrived. The station became something more than it had ever been, a place for healing, for second chances. Daniel didn't advertise. He didn't need to. Word of mouth did the work. A year later, on a fog-thick morning in April, Daniel was walking the perimeter with 2 teenage volunteers when he saw it. A shape at the edge of the woods, broad, familiar. A black bear, full-grown now, standing at the tree-line, eyes fixed on the cabin. Daniel stopped. So did the bear. Neither moved for a long moment. Then Ash turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel smiled. He didn't call after him. He didn't need to. Some bonds didn't break, they simply stretched across distance, tethered by memory, by gratitude, by love that spoke not in words but in survival, in presence, in returning. And in the quiet hush of a Colorado morning, with spring humming through the forest and the ghosts of fire turned to ash beneath new growth, Daniel Hale stood at the edge of the wild and knew, finally, that he had come home. The summer that followed was unlike any Daniel Hale had ever known. Not because the forest transformed in any dramatic or magical way, though it did as it always did, the snow replaced by wildflowers, the silence of winter giving way to buzzing insects and birdsong, but because Daniel himself had changed. His hands, once accustomed to solitude, now moved through the world with purpose again. They cradled orphaned kits, cleaned wounds, rebuilt fences, and gently guided the trembling hands of visiting children toward injured animals with patience he hadn't known still lived in him. The ranger station had bloomed into something more than a forgotten outpost. It had become a sanctuary, not only for wildlife, but for people. Word of mouth had reached further than Daniel expected. A local vet partnered with him, donating medicine and time. A therapist from the nearest town began organizing weekend retreats for troubled youth, kids chewed up by the world and looking for something, anything, that didn't judge or demand. They came in small groups, wide-eyed and wary, their stories tight behind clenched jaws and hardened shoulders. But something happened when they stood face to face with a wounded animal. They softened. They listened. They let themselves be seen. And Daniel quietly saw himself in each of them. He didn't talk about the fire unless asked. When he did, he kept it simple. "We lost someone out there. I couldn't bring him back." Sometimes that was all it took. One of the older kids, a boy named Tyler, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in his first 2 visits, sat beside him after those words and whispered, "Me too." They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. On another morning, Daniel found a girl named Emmy standing by the trailhead sign, staring at the second line. Wildlife sanctuary. She had a stitched fox plush tucked under her arm and tears shining in her eyes. "Why'd you make this place?" she asked. Daniel crouched beside her, resting a hand on his knee. "Because sometimes," he said, "when you help something wild heal, it heals you right back." She didn't respond, but she reached up and held his hand for a moment. That was enough. Each day, Daniel moved through the rhythms of this new life with a kind of quiet reverence: feedings, phone calls, trail walks, injuries mended, new arrivals. The station was never full. He kept it small on purpose, but the space felt vibrant now, alive. On the wall inside the main cabin, next to a bulletin board filled with names and dates and snapshots, he pinned a photo he'd finally printed. It was one he'd taken months ago, not long after Ash first stood without falling. In it, the bear's eyes were turned toward the light streaming through the cabin window, his body lean but solid, a shadow of strength behind the soft fur. Daniel titled the photo, "Ash, Day 34. Beneath it, in his tight block handwriting, he'd written, "Sometimes we survive because someone decides we're worth saving." It was late September when the letters started arriving, not emails or digital forms, actual letters. Folded sheets of paper in worn envelopes, scrawled in careful handwriting. One from a retired ranger in Montana who had read about the sanctuary in a conservation journal. Another from a mother whose son had visited in June and hadn't stopped talking about the place where animals make people better. They came with donations sometimes, or sketches, or short stories kids had written about their time with the animals. Daniel kept every one. He read them slowly, like sacred things. Sometimes they made him cry, but he didn't hide the tears anymore. Then one morning, deep in October, as the first frost clung to the windows and the trees began to blush with orange and gold, Daniel stepped outside and froze. There, at the edge of the clearing, framed by the rising sun and mist curling low to the ground, stood Ash. He was larger now, no longer a cub but a full-grown bear, his shoulders wide and powerful, his coat rich and thick for the coming winter. But it was his eyes that held Daniel, eyes that hadn't changed at all. Ash didn't move. He didn't need to. Daniel stepped off the porch and crossed the clearing in silence, stopping a dozen feet away. They stood like that for a long moment, two creatures marked by survival, by wounds, by the strange grace of choosing not to give up. "You came back," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. Ash tilted his head just slightly. Daniel smiled, heart swelling with a pressure that was neither pain nor joy but some potent mixture of both. "I don't know why," he added, "but thank you." Ash didn't stay. He turned after a while and vanished into the trees, as quiet as he'd come. Daniel didn't follow. That was the thing about love, about respect, about the wild: you didn't hold it too tight. You let it choose. You let it return. Or not. Either way, you kept the door open. That evening, he added another photo to the wall, a snapshot of the clearing, with Ash in the distance, half silhouetted by the morning light. Beneath it, he wrote, "He never really left." The first snowfall came in November, soft and silent, coating the sanctuary in white. Daniel stood on the porch as it fell, warm coffee in hand, scarf wrapped loose around his neck. Behind him, the cabin glowed with firelight. Inside, a rescued owl named Cinder blinked at him from her perch by the window. In the back room, two volunteers, teenagers from the weekend retreat, were carefully spoon-feeding an injured raccoon. Laughter drifted through the door, the kind of laughter that was healing, not loud, but real. Daniel listened, heart full. And then, slowly, he walked down the porch steps and into the falling snow. He didn't need to go far, just far enough to stand in the place where Ash had once collapsed, all broken bone and frozen breath, the day everything had changed. He crouched there now, pressing his palm to the snow-covered earth. "Thank you," he whispered again, though there was no one there to hear it. Or maybe there was. The wind stirred the trees gently, like breath on skin. Daniel stood. The sanctuary would carry on. There would always be more to rescue, more to mend, more to teach and learn and unlearn. But this was the moment he had waited for. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet. Certain. Whole. Later that night, as the snow thickened and stars blinked faintly through the drifting clouds, Daniel lit a lantern and wrote in the old logbook he kept by the door. He documented the weather, the new arrivals, the status of the fox with the fractured leg. And then, without thinking too much, he wrote one final entry at the bottom of the page: "Saw him again today. Strong. Wild. Free. No longer mine. But still part of me." He closed the book, set the pen down, and leaned back in his chair, the fire warm against his boots, the sanctuary quiet and alive around him. And outside, beneath the whispering trees, somewhere in the wide dark of the forest, Ash moved through the snow without fear, as though the world at last had made room for both the wild and the wounded. As though some things, once broken, didn't just heal, but became something stronger than before.